Hooray! Good. Enough of us kind of like bantering on and talking. I will hand over to Stephen now.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And a warm welcome and a hello to everyone. I'm not going to spend much time talking about myself. That's what LinkedIn profiles and so on are for, if people really are truly interested. Suffice to say, for our purposes, a long time in leadership in IT, turned consultant,
I'm watching
found I enjoyed working with people, perhaps more than I ever did technology. And then I kind of have ended up realizing that maybe some of the stuff I talk about sometimes is interesting to some people. So I talk more, and I've recently written a book which is broadly speaking some of the content that I'm talking about with you this evening to go there. Stuart mentioned the idea that I'll talk about sort of protocol for questions. I'm definitely someone who prefer this to be more casual than formal. So if you've got a question along the way, then by all means, raise your hand in this, put something in the chat, and we'll get back to you. I do reserve the right to postpone it at least, but if we can keep it a little bit more conversational, that's better, because I'm not sure everybody wants to just, well, we'll see. My voice might just lull you to sleep instead. So we'll see what happens. So I'm going to share my screen this side. All good, lovely. So I'll jump in. I think it's the easiest way to go. So effectively what I'm talking about in this session is an answer to the question on the right-hand side there of whether there's a right or an optimal way to lead and organize ourselves to deliver things. That's effectively the question that I asked, or I've been asking throughout my whole career, and I'll talk a bit about that too. And then over the last 4 years, I've been researching, reading, and otherwise, and I've put my book together, which effectively tries to answer that question, and then based on the answer to that question, tries to offer some thoughts and so on. Clearly, that's not something that we can do all of this evening, so I'm consider me just like bringing one little piece of this tree to you this evening, although I'm hopefully going to try and bring you some of the interesting stuff from it. Broadly, the flow will be I'm going to run you a bit through leadership and delivery, a little bit of the history and some stuff around that, and then, as I say, some conclusions on what we might do. But I'll stop every now and again and check that everybody's kind of with me. Right. So starting with leadership, which is definitely kind of where I suppose I sat. I started my own leadership journey, career, whatever you want to call it, in probably about 2000, somewhere around there. And I think I had basically this view of leadership at the time, that leaders were these sort of, well, almost literally sort of the battlefield general, as it were, cape flapping behind them, and, you know, all of a sudden all powerful, all knowing, and so on. And there were lots of things, I suppose, being naive and younger at the time, to explain stuff like this. So an average employee salary here is represented by this one little green box. An average UK CEO salary is represented by 84 of them. So clearly they're doing something right in these leadership positions. And indeed, if you're an American CEO, make that 353 times on average, the average employee in the organization, which is quite impressive. So clearly they know what they're doing and they know something, right? As I got deeper into leadership, of course, I saw pretty quickly, and I think everyone will recognize this anyway, an awful lot of what you do whenever you look after people anywhere is quite clerical. There's lots of bureaucratic activity. There's lots of what some people might call management. You know, there's plenty of people who tell you shouldn't be a leader, you shouldn't be a manager, you should be a leader, and all of this. And using that sort of lens, maybe there's some stuff that I was doing on a day-to-day basis that was a bit more leadery, but most of it was just admin. I was in a spreadsheet most of the time. That felt like pretty much what the job was about. So something didn't quite fit or didn't feel right. But of course, while that's happening, everybody and their dog will tell you that there's a right way to do something. So whether there's a right way to deliver stuff, there's a right way to lead, a right way to organize a meeting, there's a right way to everything. I'll talk a bit maybe about it later, but there's ironically, people will tell you that there's a right way to be authentic, which I think is hilarious. Anyhow, then the further you look, you then start to discover stuff like this, that this list here is 114 different styles of leadership that you might choose. if you look at LinkedIn, it tends to be 3, maybe 2, definitely. Servant leadership and authentic leadership seem to be doing the rounds at the moment, but the other 112 are there as well. And actually, this list has been updated. I'm over 150 now of different styles of leadership that are recognized as possible to use. So all of this ends up being quite confusing. So you scratch your head a bit. And then if I can just return to the CEOs for a second. This was probably one of the most generous papers I found, actually, on this subject, looking at the effectiveness of CEOs in organizations and their effect on company performance. And this, which was a study done by Mark Fitzer about 10 years ago now, identified that actually the effect that CEOs have, the important bit, that can be clearly distinguished from chance, is somewhere between basically 4 and 5%. You compare that to the company effect, which is effectively everyone else in the organization. That's not a great deal. Now, clearly, a CEO can make a decision that can floor a company pretty quickly, and they can make a decision, I suppose, if they're lucky, that will go the other way. Whether or not it justifies the 84 times salary bump that I talked about earlier, though, I guess that's the question. So referring to something I said earlier, this sort of sets up how I kind of, the route I've taken, really. I began with this view, like so many people, that there's a right way to do stuff at some point earlier in my career. Everyone was telling me that there was a right way to do things, even if I didn't think that there was, and then came to the conclusion that there probably wasn't a right way. What I've done through the research in the book is I've moved myself more to an oh my kind of place of it. The rabbit hole goes quite a lot deeper than I thought. So that's probably sounds very presumptuous. I don't mean to say it quite like that. But there was a lot more that I didn't know. And effectively, that's what I want to kind of hopefully get you along towards where I am with the oh my in some of the rest of the talk this evening. So just as a quick check-in, do people still feel like they're in the right room? This was what you were intending to come to tonight? Stuart's got some...
Yep, absolutely.
You're going to get RSI, Stuart, by the end of the evening doing that.
He's got 2 files. It's got a virtual.
Exactly. Okay, so right, so I'm going to split this up and stick with leadership to begin with, right? And I just want to put some faces up for you. So these 3, if you're trying to find out what a great leader is, looking back in history perhaps is quite a good place to start. And you can do this with everybody, of course. And we've got in a line here, you've got Genghis Khan on the left, Alexander the Great in the center, and then Lord Horatio Nelson on the right. So if you just let's take Alexander for a second in the middle. Alexander is well known, obviously, of being a strategic military genius. During his life, or during his, I was going to say during his campaign, but it's during his life, he lost no battles at all, had an absolute perfect run of success, managed to spread Hellenistic culture across the empire, and at the time created one of the largest empires that people had seen. And we generally recognize him as being this remarkable strategist. We also know about Alexander that he had something of a messiah complex. There was a story that a bolt of lightning had struck his mother's womb when he was, before he was born, and came to believe that he was actually the son of Zeus Ammon, which was actually later affirmed. He went to see an oracle in Egypt, and someone said, or rather that one of the priests actually called him out and said that he was indeed a deity. He also had quite serious problems with alcohol. Maybe quite a lot of us do, but he went as far as to, in one particular drunken fit, murder one of his closest captains, who a few months earlier had actually saved his life, but he disagreed with what he was saying and snatched a spear from one of his guards and ran him through. Right. So what's that all about? Well, I suppose you probably can already tell where this is going. There's always more than one side to these things. To the left, you've got Genghis. Certainly where we are, and certainly what I was told and what I learned about this merciless, bloodthirsty man who killed somewhere between 30 and 60 million people, which is no small feat. That's about 10% of the world's population, as it was at the time. Which, curiously, by the way, it's the only example of a war or epidemic that's ever had a noticeable impact on climate. They killed so many people that you can see it in the climate record, which is a rather terrifying thought. On the other side, of course, because I come back to the being both, he created a 24 million square kilometer empire, which was somewhere in the region of 5 times larger than Alexander. But the thing that maybe people don't realize about him, he was incredibly supportive of knowledgeable people, supported artisans, philosophers, scientists, etc., were very renowned and were always looked after, and was also religiously open. So as long as you kind of didn't cause trouble, as it were, Genghis would support you. It was said at the time that some of the trade routes, like the famous Silk Road between China and Europe, was the safest that it had ever been. And a single woman on her own could walk from one end of the Silk Road to the other without fear of attack. So once again, we have that. For Nelson on the right-hand side, I'll run through this quite quickly because it's pretty, you get the point I'm making already, no doubt. Nelson, we know as this incredibly renowned leader. Indeed, there's a massive column in London that he stands atop and continues to. He, again, like Alexander, was a hugely successful military leader, and was actually well known in his tactics for being one of the first leaders who actually tried to explain to other captains on other boats what was going on. So rather than during the literal fog of war, someone having to ask the admiral what to do now and which way should we go, they had a plan in advance, and there was some autonomy granted to the captains, which was one of the reasons that they were more successful than had previously been done. On the other side, we know that Nelson was a bit of a radical. He upset quite a few people. A serial adulterer, ended up marrying his best friend's wife, which they had to do outside of England because it wasn't legal to do so. And perhaps the most shameful thing, although you can take views on this anyway, but he was actually he supported the anti-abolitionist movement of slavery towards the end of his tenure. There are some parliamentary papers that cite letters from Nelson in support of the anti-abolition movement. So the point I'm trying to make, and it's obvious I've made the point, that there is always an upside and a downside to this stuff. You can examine almost any leader anywhere, and you can look at a lens that will show you both sides to anybody that you can care to think about. We still, however, have that sort of reverential idea of leaders. And really, as I sort of step away from history and I sort of start to bring us into the theory at the beginning of the 20th century, that idea of there being a person to look for came out in the writings of this guy. So Thomas Carlyle, who was a Scottish historian and philosopher. And I'll just quote the first part of this. In his work, he was considered that the ideal way to lead any nation was effectively to find the right person to do it. So if you find the ablest man, and obviously it would be a man at the time, that exists, raise him to the supreme place and loyally reverence him, you have the perfect government for that country. So following on that idea of a great leader from history, Carlyle, as this essayist, historian, philosopher, was very much promoting the idea that we get this superpower leader where we can pay them 353 times the average worker because that's exactly the right person. And that's been in our philosophy for quite a long time. As we apply a bit more science, perhaps, to leadership, though, and I will bring this up to date, don't worry. I'm not going to spend all of my time sort of at least I'm in the 20th century now. I'm getting somewhere. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were two real schools of thought around leadership that started to come through, and they are these: trait and behavioral. Trait is, these are rather self-explanatory, I suppose, but traits are the characteristics of the leader themselves, and behavior is about how that leader operates with other people. So the schools of thought were saying, if we get the right kind of traits, or if we get the right kind of behaviors, then we might have a good leader in our midst. So one example of this, which was done by, this is another psychologist, Charles Bird, he did an exercise where he contacted a number of organizations, a number of companies, and effectively said, what are the traits that you find most effective in your leaders. And here's a list of what came back. And there's some lovely ones in here, bearing in mind that this is in 1940, things like moral courage and things. We don't tend to see those so often. But interestingly, of the companies that came back, half of them said that high intelligence was required every time in a leader, and 30% said initiative was required. The curious thing, of course, is that 65% of the traits here only appeared once. And what do you think that tells us?
Lots of divergence.
Yeah, absolutely. We're missing the... It depends, basically. A leader in a police force is going to be very different to perhaps a leader in a bakery, for example. Excuse that. I don't know particularly why I went to those examples, but I did. But that makes a whole load of sense. And we intuitively know this. If there's a fire in the building, you don't want to do, as nice as it was, Stuart, we don't want to do an icebreaker at the start and find out what everyone's favorite ice cream is. We've just got to get everybody out of the building as quickly as possible. And we need some autocracy, thanks. At the other end, of course, if you're trying to, I don't know, release a product, you've got some sort of creative marketing design program or whatever it is, then more collaborative leadership is probably what you want. And clearly there's a spectrum between those things. The meeting of minds that this kind of gets to is ideally you have the right kind of leader for the right kind of or for the specific situation that you're facing, which kind of makes some logical sense. And there's a simple way to illustrate this, which is an example from the 1980s. In the UK, this was in about 1982, I think, excuse me, not knowing the date, but at the beginning of the 1980s at least, we were doing, so during the Cold War, we were doing some role-playing and thinking of ideas of what we would do in the event of nuclear fallout. So how would we respond and so on? What would be the government's actions and so on? And one suggestion which came from the Home Office was this, that we should identify and know where the psychopaths are. Because to the conversation that I've just described about having the right kind of person at the right kind of time, the thinking here was that you need to make immediate and sometimes extremely uncomfortable decisions. Who can do that? We mentioned AI briefly earlier, and one of the classic things that gets thrown at those tools is the trolley problem. The idea that a tram is loose and it's going to run into a group of people. You have the opportunity to pull a lever which will steer it away so that it kills only one person instead. Do you do it? A psychopath would have no problem pulling that lever because it's a statistical thing to say, yep, I'll kill one person rather than four. That was the theory. By the way, this didn't actually ever turn up, as it was just an idea thrown around. It didn't become part of the plan. But I thought it was an interesting idea. So this is broadly where we've got up to. But then the question that I had, at least, was, well, how on earth does any of that bear any relation to this? Because if there are a ton of leadership styles out of there, what am I going to do? And how do I know whether or not there are things that I should apply? So then, and I've done quite a lot of this stuff, I've started looking at some of the individual techniques themselves, and servant leadership always seems to get associated with the world of agility. So, and there are plenty of, there's just some statistics there, I shan't read any of it, but it's a very popular idea, servant leadership. You see it in almost every day on LinkedIn somewhere. So taking a look at one of the frameworks out there, and this is Sipe and Frick, they've got 7 pillars of what they say are a good servant leader would have. So they do things like put people first. I suppose that makes sense. You're serving other people. A person of character, maybe, and that leading with moral authority. Maybe I'm not quite so sure about some of those, but still, that's what they say. It's incredibly difficult to find any data about this, and I'll come back to why a bit later on, about whether or not this actually works. But one paper at least, which is I thought had been done very well. It was very well structured. I can share any of the links to the research that I did on this anyway, and of course it's all in the book. But if you consider a team or an operation from the perspective of trust, this particular paper described two kinds of trust as having an effect on teams. So the first is cognitive trust. And cognitive trust, as it kind of says on the tin, I suppose, is all about a leader's ability. So a leader that knows what they're doing effectively can create cognitive trust in a team. And that creates task performance. So I suppose the way to think about this maybe is like classic artisan kind of management in that way. The expert that knows what they're doing will help a team to produce excellence in the quality of what they're doing, because there's a link between the capability and the knowledge. The second thing is effective trust. And this is different. This is a leader that cares for and looks after and looks out for their team. That doesn't create task performance. That creates individual performance in the sense of it creates motivation. And it also does this thing called organizational citizenship behavior, which is effectively being a nice person around the office and looking after and closing the door behind you, and that sort of stuff, caring for the environment you're in. Any guesses as to what servant leadership tends to help with, cognitive or effective?
Effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Servant leadership helps with effective trust. And you think, well, okay, that's great, because we can, we employ smart people in the first place, so there's no real problem there. And we're just going to look after them, and then we're okay. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of a standard, I suppose, where in teams, or for individuals in a team, trust tends to be developed in this direction. So you have to have a sense that the team you're part of and the leader you're working for knows what they're doing first, before effective trust starts to kick in. The good news, though, is that other leaders or even specialists within the team can perhaps provide some of that cognitive trust. But servant leadership on its own, if you only, I'm asking you to be probably unfairly pure here, if you only had effective trust through servant leadership in a team, it really isn't everything that you need. So again, you can look at this in almost any of the leadership styles. They often aren't suitable for every situation that you're coming up against. They may be broadly okay, but there's always going to be something to think about. So just before I shift focus into delivery, and hopefully I haven't put people to sleep too much just yet, there's a pause and a chance. If anyone's got a question at the moment, then please jump in. Stuart's got his hand up already.
I put my hand over Adam's face, which is amazing in my picture. There you go. Good. I think there's another thing with this one is, as you will probably end up doing the thing before you lead the people who are doing the thing. And so when you put this arrow on here, before you explained it, I kind of went like, okay, well, you are junior doing the thing, and you get better at it, and then you end up leading the people who are doing the thing. Mm-hmm. Therefore, doing the left tends to happen temporally before doing the things on the right.
Yes, and in technical spaces particularly, Google famously discovered that when they tried to have non-technical leaders. So people that were exceptional at leading but didn't necessarily know how to code, and it was a disaster. Yeah. And they've gone back to needing both capabilities each time. It's interesting when you look at the paper, or when you look at what people are saying about servant leadership and so on, and some of the lost his name. Nope, it's going to be very boring viewing. But some of the books on servant leadership very much talk about the fact that it should be all about the right-hand side and not about the left-hand side at all, as much as that's the journey you've come through, to the point where they claim you will be a better leader if you don't know how to do what the team are doing, which I thought was quite curious.
I suppose that takes you away from micromanaging them with historic knowledge. So which is a bad thing, as in like, because I used to do that 10 years ago. Let me tell you how I did it now, and that will annoy everybody from a software engineering point of view. Yeah. And there's also the ongoing argument that seems to go around LinkedIn about non-technical or technical scrum masters, yeah, as a thing, yeah, as in like how that gets kind of framed as well. So yeah, cool, good, thank you.
What I'm going to keep coming back to, if it wasn't already obvious, I suppose, is that there's an awful lot of it depends
Yeah.
on this stuff. It does make my toes curl when I read a paper that says you've got to be this thing or you've got to be that thing. That's unfortunately never going to be true. I'll step into delivery and then we'll get into some of the more kind of so what stuff. So for delivery, because the reason I talk about delivery with leadership at the same time is theoretically leadership is all about trying to get something done. So somehow we're trying to control or rather organize our organization, if you like, in the way that we work and operate at the same time as lead. So if I start with the simplest of deliveries here, let's say a loaf of bread, and we've got what I was taught very strenuously earlier in my career, which was that in these three stages, we've got some ingredients, some process, and some output. If we control the quality of the input and we control the quality of the process, we will guarantee a quality of output at the end. Which, go with me on that for the moment. And I suppose if you're thinking about just a culinary thing for a second, it's certainly the case that good quality ingredients will provide a better loaf, if not always guarantee a superb one, than poor quality ingredients. So at least we can go that far. That sort of idea is fine with the stuff that you can kind of get your hands on. And you could even extend this loaf of bread far further back into the process, and you could control what the farmer plants, for example. You can control the purity of the salt that you're using in the thing, or the temperature of the ovens, etc., etc. And that's fine. You can control all of that. But the problem comes when you try and do something a bit bigger, like build a cathedral, for example. Suddenly it gets a lot harder to map that sort of stuff out, and you'd be there forever doing it. I did say I was going to come into the 20th century, but I'm going to go right back again for a while. Sorry about that. The way that we've handled this in the past was through the advent of guilds. And we quite often hear guilds turning up in organizations these days. It's pretty much the same sort of idea. Guilds, if I just zoom in here are a few. For example, the third one along there is our baker. The guilds effectively did two major things. For the buyer, it guaranteed a little bit of quality. So if you imagine that I was trying to build that cathedral and I needed 200 stonemasons, by working with a guild, I can get hold of a level of quality, some guarantee almost that I'm going to get the right thing, and it will stop me being fleeced, I suppose, potentially by different people. And very much the other way, as an individual artisan, working with a guild gives me protection, probably access to suppliers and so on, and more guaranteed work. So it was a pretty good way of organizing large projects and activities. One guy, this is Becker, who looked after a number of chemical factories in Germany. He laid this out as being, this is how you should structure your workshop. Wherever you are, this is what you do. At the top, you have this consularius laboratorii with a dispensator in the center and then the laborers at the bottom. The guy at the top tells everybody what to do. The guy in the middle is responsible for making everybody do it, and the people at the bottom just have to do what they're told. That had the advantage, I suppose, like we've just been talking about getting stuff done, but it perpetuated a little bit, if you hadn't already worked it out, it perpetuated a bit of, or rather mirrored what was going on in society at the same time. It was a good way of kind of keeping the working class in a working position at the bottom. That was at the end of the 17th century, but this idea continues, it pervades. And I know people in this group, Stuart, Adam, no doubt at all, will know about Taylor on the left-hand side of this picture, and I've got Sloan here. So these are both captains of industry, I suppose, in their own way. Taylor on the left was famous for his views on scientific management, effectively the idea being that if you could write down and understand in prescribed detail the task that people were doing, you could then scientifically make it more efficient. Thus, that point about shovels being a certain size, because no matter what you're lifting, or rather, a shovel should always be 21 pounds in weight to be most efficient. A labourer can move stuff better that way. So if you're moving light things, you have a large shovel, like a snow shovel. And if you're moving heavy things, you have a small one. And it makes the workers more efficient. But that sort of thinking, his book is fascinating. It's full of examples like that. Sloan, bringing a bit further up to date, he had the idea in General Motors that you could divide everything up and every problem could be broken down. So if you gave an engineer an engine that wasn't working properly, of course they'd be able to fix it because they could just work out the detail underneath.
Stephen, let's ask you to go back one slide just for a second. I think you might have a question on it.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I haven't got the chat up. Excuse me.
That's right. Was there a question on this one?
Did you just want to...
Okay.
I was just connecting it to what you were to your larger narrative. Sorry about that, and I just didn't. No. I was looking at the left, and then I didn't see what you had on the right. So
no problem at all. Thank you. So to that kind of thinking, we kind of understand it gets stuff done, and you can kind of control stuff. But levels of control have adverse consequences, and perhaps a favourite example of this was in the 1980s, somewhere, I think it was out in Wiltshire, that sort of direction, where a local council was running an event, and they'd hired some Morris men to come along, no relation, but they'd hired some Morris men to come along to dance at this particular event. And they sent them the forms and things to fill in, and unfortunately, they didn't dance because they couldn't demonstrate that they had ISO 9000 compliance. The department wasn't allowed to employ anybody that didn't, which I thought was lovely. We can thank Margaret Thatcher for that, by the way. That was that government agreed that everyone that dealt with the government has to have ISO. So while that stuff's going on, there are other ideas happening, right? So there's that sort of control frame that way. But there are also people around like this guy, Deming. And Deming is one of a few people who were looking more broadly than trying to control what an individual worker did. And we're thinking much more in terms of the broader system that the worker was operating within. So as the bit highlighted in red here, encouraging people to look at the deficiencies in systems and process to find the solution, rather than making sure that they've got the right kind of particular tool or the particular kind of attitude as they come to work. He encapsulated this stuff in his book, Out of the Crisis. Many people, well, show of hands if there is such a thing, or have you had a chance to read Out of the Crisis? Nope. Okay, that's definitely a recommendation from here, if nothing else. And I'll describe a few reasons why. So you probably then, you may have seen his 14 points at some stage. So Deming lists 14 points, which effectively say these are things that you should think about in your organization. For anybody who's touched on lean, you'll recognize this stuff pretty quickly. So things like ceasing dependence on inspection. So the point here is, instead of waiting until the end of your process and then checking whether or not it's good enough, why don't we build quality in from the beginning so that every stage means that we get quality out at the other end, and therefore we're more efficient? He talked about leadership rather than management, the idea being that the people in that position were coaching, not judging. And one of the other ones I call out here is about driving out fear. You know, everybody thinks that psychological safety is new. It's not. There's actually plenty of examples of it from 200 BC, but there's also plenty of examples here. He wrote about it well ahead of the kind of the populism that we've got now. The other 11 are well worth reading, and it's worth reading the book rather than just Googling the 14 points and sticking them on the wall, because it really does explain a little bit about why you might be interested in them. What this all sets up, and this is kind of where I got to, is that there are two broad philosophies, I think, around work and getting stuff done. And that's these. You've either got a management of output kind of philosophy, i.e. a tailorist one, if you like, and you've got an enablement one on the other side. And just color that in a bit. For the outputs, I'll put things like ISO that I've already talked about, quite a lot of ITIL. I definitely will put SAFe on that side for the way that it orchestrates the way that it orchestrates work. But then you've got things on the right-hand side, truly adaptive project management, some lean manufacturing, some concepts of business agility, and so on. The broad point I'm trying to make, though, is that there's almost a decision to make when you've got a bit of work in front of you to say, do we want more central control or do we want more individual autonomy? If you want a lighter view of that, I kind of liken it to the classic cat and dog sort of thing. The first philosophy is about doing what you're told, and the second one is about doing everything my own way, thanks, and I'll go that way. So I'll just move up to a bit of a summary of where we are. So the realities of leadership aren't quite as black and white as I thought. The leader impact isn't where we need it to be. There's no such thing as no absolute great leaders out there. The shifting schools of thought, and we can't really seem to agree because every organization we've ever worked in will have different views on outputs versus enablement and so on. And I've got another box missing. I just saw the note from Aaron about Kaizen. Can I come back to that a little bit later, if that's okay? And I promise I will. So let me just fill in this box in the corner. Okay, so everybody's favorite car. It's got to be I say that, I don't think I ever really want to own one, but still. Let's imagine we've got our DeLorean here, and we've got it. I've just realized I think I've spelled that wrong as well. Anyway, I have. It's EAN anyway. But a DeLorean is plugged into a torque meter here. So all we're trying to do is identify effectively how much power this vehicle can put down onto the road based on the known equation of force times distance. Okay, so there's some actual numbers for a DeLorean there, and it produces somewhere around 207 Newton meters at 5,500 RPM. Okay, so we know that. We can test that, and we can test that 100 times and broadly come up with the same answer. What we could also do is do a bit of an upgrade. Sorry, I realized you didn't have the text on there, excuse me. We could also do a bit of an upgrade to this thing. And we could, let's say we're going to stick a flux capacitor in it, and this is totally bullshit, of course, excuse me. But I've got a new calculation now which comes out with a new measure for torque for the vehicle. The point I'm trying to make is this is a fairly straightforward experiment of I can test and verify the performance in both cases quite easily, and I know that it's accurate. If you take that sort of thinking to something a little bit more real, and the process for developing a drug, there is a very stringent and long process behind the marketing of any drug. It starts with the beginning with some sort of idea, something we want to do. We want to find a cure for X or whatever. Then from what starts with sometimes hundreds of thousands of different potential molecules, it gets whittled down through clinical tests, through trials, through eventually to the point where that single drug gets approved, at which point it goes into production. And theoretically, even something like paracetamol, if we discovered that it had some degenerative effect that we hadn't realized, it could still be withdrawn and unlicensed. Okay, so there's a very clear process. The point is we know what the problem is through this, and we understand the effects of the thing we're going to do. Challenge is when you try and turn that to anything in the social sciences space. So I've got a couple here, one probably less upsetting than the other. So Tuckman, everybody's familiar with forming, norming, storming, performing. Okay, if fewer people seem to know that that was done in a small group of people. It was an exercise done in Bethesda in Maryland in the 1960s with a small group of research scientists. And maybe it was true for them. Maybe that's how their team formed. But how does that have any relation to your team? How does that have any relation when you've got a team that are online doing the kind of work that we're doing right now? We can't say that. And yet it somehow hit the main kind of the discourse. And I have genuinely never been on a training course that someone hasn't told me or mentioned that as if it's gospel, as if it's true. There's loads of these, and I'll talk about it. So a sharp intake of breath. How about the Agile Manifesto? 17 people in a ski lodge in Utah telling you that that's the best way to run your business. Okay. So just a little aside before I get attacked too much about saying this sort of thing. I appreciate that there's a lot of tacit knowledge in the people. So they have delivered a lot of software, almost to the point you made, Stuart, earlier about the servant leader. They've got experience and exposure. So maybe there's some good stuff in it. But people don't take it as, you might like to try this. Unfortunately, it seems to have gone quite beyond that to, if you don't do this, then you're not doing it properly.
Yeah.
I must also say, just in case anyone thinks I'm just bashing outside, this pretty little picture here was a leadership framework that I launched a few years ago, which was my attempt at saying this is how you should lead your teams and organizations. And to the same point, maybe there's some stuff in it that's interesting. But do I know anything about you, your organization, the problems you're getting, the kind of challenges you've got? No, of course not. I've got none whatsoever. And as a quick throwaway thing, if you ever see anything that rhymes, run away. Because that will not have proof at all. The point that it comes to, unfortunately, is when you look at this stuff, whether it's Olson, it's Tuckman, it's Maslow, there's no proof for any of this stuff. We do not know that it's true. They may be things that we can have a good conversation about, but we do not know if they're right. It gets slightly worse than this, though. Let's try this little example. Let's imagine we've got a project and we're delivering it we've got a team that use Agile, whichever framework or method you like. And they've got a budget and they come in ahead of time and ahead of budget. Brilliant. But because they want to, the team are a little bit more interested, I suppose, in practice, they try another project. And this time they do it with waterfall, with the same timeline and the same budget. And it comes in even better. But I thought Agile was supposed to be the winner. But of course, this isn't, if you haven't already picked up, this is not fair. Because between project 1 and project 2, the team have developed a huge amount of tacit knowledge. They've got views of end users. They understand relationships between each other that they didn't do before. The market has changed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a valid equivalence. And regretfully, we never have this wormhole that we can slip back through to find out whether or not, had we done it with this instead, we would have ended up with a different result. This is not like the drug. We can't prove it to a better level, and it's certainly not as simple as a DeLorean on a torque meter. If you take that to something like OKRs, John Doerr happily, in his subtitle for his book, talked about OKRs rocking the world. But to the point I just made, if that's Google's performance over from 2002 to 23, following that sort of orange line there, we cannot know whether or not without OKRs, they would have had poorer performance, or would have indeed been much better had they not used OKRs. Of course, John Doerr will tell you that it was all because of OKRs, because he's trying to sell his book, but that's unfortunately how it is. So coming back to this, it makes it a slightly worse again to say that it's unproven and unprovable that any of this stuff works. So it kind of gets to a general conclusion of where we are. I think I still might come back to Kaizen a little bit later, because I think that needs a bit more of a conversation, but I promise I won't miss it. So if people okay, actually, I might stop for a chance to ask a question, because I appreciate I'm just going through a lot of stuff here. Okay, even though I've come to an Agile thing and said that the manifesto has no proof. Good.
I mean, like, if you look at the people who wrote it and the constitution of that group, then how can it be correct?
Yep. Thank you very much, Stuart. I suddenly feel slightly warmer inside, and my connection's not going to be cut.
Exactly. Exactly.
I'm sure there are some that I would. Right. So one of the questions, and there's a lot in the book about this, and I'm only going to touch on a couple of bits, but why do we do it? Right. Because I don't think, as much as nobody at the beginning of a training course says, you can use Maslow, but there's no proof. So as much as nobody says that, we still go ahead with this stuff, and we probably still know that this stuff doesn't exist. Oh, by the way, just the worst culprit for that one is the forgetting curve. If you must have seen, I say Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve, this idea that after half an hour you forget half of what you got told in a training course and so on. That's a beautiful one. That result he tested on himself in his own lab. That's it. That's the proof.
Wow.
So and doing something that didn't bear any relation to what he did normally. So it was brilliant. He was trying to learn random bits of text, like, yeah, right. So the question about why we don't do them, and if you imagine that most people in an organization, and again, Stuart, coming back to the thing you said about coming through the path that you've come through, when you're thinking about how to organize and how to lead and how to operate, you use your experience. You build on the capabilities that you're aware of yourself and the people around you. You're sensitive to what's happening. That's super. That really is. And that's basically what I'm get to in the end of this, is that's where we need to be getting to. We understand more about the environment than anyone outside. Unfortunately, there's a couple of things that get in the way. One is that I'm limited by my own knowledge. I just don't know what I don't know. You know, if someone in a shiny suit turns up and tells me that there's a better way of doing something, who am I? And then there's a slightly more, they're both very human. But if you push for your idea, your way of organizing in an organization, it makes you very vulnerable. The results and the outcomes are all on your shoulders. If it doesn't work, everyone's going to look at you, and that's quite uncomfortable at times. So that can prevent us pushing. Often what I see are two results of that. One is teams not really being sure why they're doing something, but doing it because their boss said so. I've had that with OKRs, with Agile, with all sorts of stuff. Yeah, no, we've just got to do that. By the way, I've even had leadership teams telling me that they've got to do something because their board told them. So it doesn't actually have to happen. It happens everywhere. So that's one way. The other that I'll just briefly touched on is a classic of, I'm working with this company because of who they are. The classic, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. The thing that we forget, though, is that the companies that have that reputation are normally organized more like this. They've got a huge number of marketing people, a few people who do finance to count all the money that they're taking, and a few delivery people maybe in the basement that go out to do stuff from time to time. So when the CEO of XYZ HQ went to university with your CEO, you haven't really got much chance anyway, and it's just going to kind of happen. And the classic bit of sales technique at the bottom of, well, you could go with the competition. They're really cheap. I don't know how they do it. You know, that sort of language doesn't help. To kind of underline this point, here's a few things that I've taught Big Four consultants last year. And I won't read them all, but the Eisenhower Matrix, fair enough. He was about 19, so I don't think he really knew that one. You've probably had this experience of why lean isn't the same as agile. That tends to be quite a common conversation. That empowerment and autonomy aren't the same. Smart, you get the idea, right? But because of that sharp suit and that marketing department, unfortunately, it's very easy to defer to the people around you. So I'm just going to get to a what now kind of moment, I think, because that's, if you believe anything that I've said so far, where do you go? To start that, I'd just like to invite you to have a look at a picture for me, okay? So just invite everybody to look at that. Okay, and then what I'd like you to do is just tell me what the missing letter is, please. Anyone?
A.
An A? Yep. Absolutely. Soap. Not soup. No, exactly. This is just a simple example of priming, which is what marketeers and magicians and so on do to you all the time. If you try this with your own teams, if you show people a picture of tomatoes, they will go U, and if you show them pictures of dirty hands, they tend to go A, because you've got an association in your mind about those two things. So it's a cheap parlor trick, really. The reason I mentioned that, though, is it sets up this idea of context, which is fundamentally what I now spend my time talking to my clients and associates about. So context is, in the example I just gave you, I set some context which forced your hand to answer in a certain way. Context we understand fairly straightforwardly as being the situation in which stuff happens. And just before I go much further, who has any awareness of any sense-making or context supporting tools like Cynefin, Confluence, things like that? Stuart, yeah. Cool, okay. So, brilliant. I won't dwell too much on this, then we can go a bit faster. How am I doing for time, Stuart, Adam?
Good. Yeah, good. So you've been going for about 50 minutes. Okay,
I will. Clearly, I don't want to deliver you the whole book because then you definitely would be asleep. So I can move through this relatively fast, and just to kind of catch you up to the place, I suppose. So I'll start actually without talking about any of the frameworks and say that in terms of context, if you think about a situation which you're facing from the route of unpredictable through to predictable, so the things around you are either unpredictable or predictable, counterintuitively, because that's how I've done this slide, starting at the wrong end. Predictable things like, say, making a paper aeroplane, we can repeat that task several times. We know exactly what's going on. And maybe that Taylorist stuff we talked about earlier would work beautifully. Indeed, that's what it's exactly the sort of thing it's designed for. It also is designed for more intricate things. This is a Mars satellite slowly finding its way to orbit around Mars. If you get the maths right, you can predict that and we can control it. Through to things which are unpredictable, like adding life forms of one type or another to an ecosystem. So here is a crayfish, for example, the American crayfish. And then through to this sort of very chaotic end where actually there's a disaster or something genuinely is, things are happening so quickly that you can't even really understand what happened, even after the fact. So we understand this sort of stuff. So just to, I suppose, set a bit of a stall out for where we've got to from the deck so far, if on the left-hand side here, our ability to adapt is more important in the kind of situation that we're in, then more adaptive practices would help us, and the opposite the other way. If it's quite predictive, then I've just realized the text at the top says the same thing twice. So that's a mistake in this slide. I think my audience is more intelligent than my slideware, so that's good. But although that was always going to be the case. So if we take that and ignore the text at the top because it's wrong on the next slide as well, then we would say, well, okay, over on the left-hand side here, where there is more unpredictability, activities and actions that foster experimentation are going to be over that side, fixed procedure over the other side, and maybe Scrum and Prince sort of land in there somewhere for delivery, and we can do that. And just as a quick example of this, and for those familiar with Cynefin and using those sort of tools, this will already be very obvious anyhow. If I imagine that I've got some actions, it really doesn't matter what these are, but this is just a product launch. I can lay those things out on, let's say, a line here of predictability between more and less. And we can say, well, okay, one of the developers quitting over here is definitely something unpredictable. We don't know what we're going to do. And we've just got some ordering to do that side. And it gives us a chance to put contextually appropriate practice around them. So the way that we handle task 3 is going to be different to the way that we handle task 18. Pretty obvious stuff. We can, because it's not as easy as that. One other context which is obvious is an organization's disposition. So if an organization is one, for example, that is very Taylorist and wants to manage the outputs you produce, and then another organization at the other end, then maybe you end up with this sort of picture where you say, if you've got a very highly unpredictable organization with a company sort of culture and outlook, which is all about enabling people, then something like Scrum is probably going to be a pretty good fit down in that corner, probably, and so on. This is intentionally making a number of assumptions, which is kind of why I get to the probably thing. So another quick quiz. Just invite you all to imagine a lion for me. Okay, so could somebody tell me what they were thinking about, please?
A lion sitting down. Oh, sorry, yes, here you go.
Lucy.
Okay, he's sitting down and got a big mane and hungry and a long tail.
Thank you. Who had something different?
Very similar. Big teeth, mane, orange.
Yeah, I had a male lion standing up, looking to the right. He had all 4 legs and his tail. All of it was there.
Yep. Anything else? Thank you, Esther. One named Mufasa coming in from... Yep.
Yeah.
Super, thank you. Oh, and a cartoon image of the Lion King cub as well. So, exactly. No one said chocolate bar in this group. That one comes up sometimes with this one, which is quite interesting. But the point that this very simple exercise hopefully demonstrates, and this is another useful one for a team, is that we might just imagine that information kind of goes into our brains and comes out the other side in a very predictable way, but it genuinely doesn't. And that's because of our own experiences, our own understanding, our own, literally our own context. And I'll talk more about that in a sec. So this is obviously a challenging in an organization, because if you say something like, we want to put the customer at the heart of what we do, in 30 seconds, we've just demonstrated that we can't agree on what a lion is. And yet we say words like that and phrases like that in our organizations as if we know. And the way to solve, if you like, the lion problem is actually to spend some time talking about it, to hear different people's opinions, to understand what people are coming from, and maybe understand together what we mean by a lion. We don't tend to do that when we start talking about this new transformation is going to do XYZ thing in the company.
Hi, can I just say you remind me of something that I talk about a lot in customer service training. People often pipe up this idea because they've heard it so many times. Oh, well, you should always treat people the way you want to be treated yourself. I say, no, that's just the beginning. That's the starting block in customer service. You know, your customer, you got to treat them the way they want to be treated. And you just really made me think of that. So hopefully I'm listening properly to what you're saying.
But that's exactly the point. It's so easy to assume that people around you understand. I've actually really discovered this with my being a father. I find myself getting frustrated sometimes that my son can't do stuff, but then I forget that I've got 35 more years of tacit knowledge than he has. So of course I know how to do that thing because I've buggered it up 100 times, and which is never really very fair. So just that context thing, it's not as simple as just saying situation. So as much as we might talk about Cynefin, for example, which is very good at talking about actually situation in this list, there are lots of other types of context that affect what we do. That could be, for example, the actor's mind, I suppose. But if we talk about life world, for example, one of the things on here, which is about the sort of environment that you understand and the way that you interpret things, maybe that leads you to come up with a particular kind of lion. The reason why I say any of this and say that any of this is important is even if you discover in your organization that most of your work sits somewhere in a complex space and therefore you should be using agile practice, or rather agile practice might be a better choice for you, there's a lot more stuff going on underneath as well, which is often worth talking about. One of the leading lights of this, who unfortunately, she died a few years ago now, about 3 years ago, was a lady called Brenda Dervin, who is alongside the greats of sense makers. If David Snowden and Cynthia Kurtz, people like that, even Stacey, are over here thinking about environment, she was all about understanding how to communicate with people and how to understand what was going on the other side. One of the things that she said, which I think is honestly my favorite quote of hers, was that this idea that each person is someone with, well, you can read it for yourselves, but every person has such a unique experience as they approach any given situation that we really should slow down and pay a little bit of attention to where they're coming from. When we blanket into an organization and say we're all going to work in this way from now, we ride roughshod over every single person in the organization, kind of no matter who they are. Her thinking brought across this idea, or rather her thinking ended up in this lovely diagram. I always like it because it's like she drew it on an Etch-a-Sketch. It's beautiful in her book. It really is. I've done my best to recreate it in a second, but this might look rather complicated, but it's actually very logical, but I think it's worth understanding what it is. So I'll break down this metaphor for you with my version of her one. So we've got a person, us, for example, trying to reach some kind of goal in the distance, right? So let's make this really easy for the example. And the situation is hungry, and the outcome we want on the other side is that we're not hungry anymore. Satisfied, I'm not sure quite what I meant by that, but anyway, no longer hungry will do. So that's where we're trying to get to. So the gap, this delta in the middle, could be, well, we don't know what we want to eat, we don't know when, we don't know how much, we've got sort of lots of stuff. So each of us, when we're approached with these kind of situations, and we'll have these all the time, it doesn't have to be anything really big. It's not, how am I going to particularly vote? Where am I going to live? Which school am I going to send my child? It doesn't matter. You know, it can be tiny things. The bridge that will get you there is effectively who you are. This is your kind of, your experience, is your unique person. The person that told you that the lion was Mufasa, or was someone sitting down, or another one standing up looking to the right. That's all come from that bit. So, for example, in this case, we might just say, well, okay, I fancy some chocolate, so we'll just go straight across the top and we don't have to think about it. Or I could try and make a bit of sense about what's going on, and maybe I can ask some other people about things. And this is basically how we make sense of situations. So a slightly more complicated one, our CEO wants to put AI on everything. What are our outcomes? Well, a decent answer for the CEO, and AI actually improves something would be nice, I suppose. The gap in that case is probably what the CEO really wants. How might we get started, and so on. The bridge in that case, maybe we read something. You know, we were on the register the other day and we thought about something fun. And then down here, we've got the, we could go out and start talking around to people as well. Just to my fellow namesake, talking about fast and slow, that's where, so a lot of the context that you are using in that bridge is exactly that. It's the habits, the biases, the system one stuff that's embedded deep into your brain. Sense making really is where the verbings piece comes in, and being able to talk about that. So I'm nearly there, and then we can kind of open it up, and I will come back to Kaizen as I promised. So just to briefly talk about the bit in the middle, because I know we talk about Cynefin, and Cynefin is a deep hole that you can go into. You can spend years understanding the nuances of it, especially when you get into liminal zones and so on. This is all listed in the book anyway, and if this is being recorded, then people can look at this later. But just a list of some tools that you might use in that verbings space. So whether that be Cynefin or Wardley mapping, for example, will help you to kind of come to terms with the situation, through to de Bono. Even a yin-yang symbol will help you to consider a situation perhaps in a different way together. And of course, you can create your own. But in each case, rather than just assuming that you know the answer, you can broadly come together to talk about it instead. So I think I'm going to skip this little bit on Cynefin because you understand that already. And step into, I'm just going to talk about VUCA briefly as a sense-making tool, because that's actually what it is. So everyone will be familiar with VUCA. They've seen it everywhere. The Agile Business Consortium, among others, describe constantly that we're living in a VUCA world. We're not, just to be clear about that for a second. VUCA isn't one thing. VUCA is a description of different types of disruption that might be impacting the situation that you're in. So in the same way that you, for example, might be familiar with using Cynefin to understand the environment and the situation that you're facing, you can do the same using VUCA. There may be some stuff in your world that is complex, but there may also be some stuff which is volatile. So in that verbing section again, we could, for example, do something like this. We could say, we've got a list of our things that we've got to do. And we can use VUCA to examine the work that we've got in front of us. A lot of it won't be VUCA. Some of it might be. And if, for example, we've got some stuff that's volatile, then the activities we perform when we get up to that space are going to be different to those than if it were complex or ambiguous. Broadly, what I'm getting to, and I promise I'm very nearly done. Just looking at Adam's face, it looks like you're really ready to fall off. Sorry, my friend.
Oh.
I'm just going to throw a couple of tips at you, and then I promise I'll close. So, what I'm saying, if you imagine the Dervin thing for a second, of saying we're trying to get across a gap, there's a quick way across a gap, which is what we believe to be true, or what the consultant sells us, and we can just get straight across the gap, and yeah, we're sorted. What I'm encouraging you to do really is spend a little bit more time in the gap and use some of those tools to understand what you're facing and therefore make more contextually appropriate decisions. You may not be right, but at least you've got a bit more understanding of the situation and therefore a better chance of really realizing what you're doing. Briefly, just touching on Kaizen in here, that's exactly my understanding. Maybe you'll come back to me on this, but that broadly speaking, that's what you're doing. By examining and understanding what you've got in front of you, you can make small and continuous improvements and get immediate feedback to the benefits and the changes that you're making. You're still pursuing some sort of thing in the future, but it's a very context and activity connected change that you're making. It's not some random thing from a book. You're definitely trying to do something in the context of where you're working. Maybe we'll come back around to that. I'll just talk about 3 tips very quickly. The first one, and if you've ever done anything with Cynefin, you will know this already, I'm sure, which is it is much, much better to have several sense-making type conversations with different people than it is to have one. It is even better to have diversity in those conversations. So if you have sales, finance, IT, whatever it might be, but you get different opinions and it will give you a better result the other side. The last thing is that the implication perhaps of some of what I've said is that the amount of effort, or rather the amount of sense that you can have of a situation is going to be somehow proportional to the amount of effort you put in. You spend more time chatting about it, you're going to understand it more and more. The reality is, in my experience, more like this. You get a good amount of return, but then you pretty quickly get to a stage where you're not going to discover much more, and you'd be better off trying something and then coming back again to start. And this picture can sort of go in all sorts of different directions depending on where we are. So as a summary, just to say what I've said, really, there are big questions about how you might operate. And unfortunately, when you get underneath it, there's no historical template for success, changeable contacts everywhere, and no one really has any impact, and you can't prove anything works even if you think it did. So that's a bit of a problem. Unfortunately, in the middle, and I didn't talk about this, that's covered by, or continues because of things like commercialization. A $400 billion leadership industry does not want you to stop going on their training courses. We've also got social order and things like that stand in the way a little bit. What I'm inviting people to do is this, which is to continuously make sense using all of those tools, which are all completely free. You don't need a consultant. You don't even need a facilitator. You can do all of this stuff for yourself in the middle. And then that might just lead you to say, well, those things are probably better right now. Let's try those. and then see where we get to from that. If you want a really super summary of that, situation plus dream framework is not the right way to go. My suggestion is this: frequent sense making gives you more chance of success. It's kind of where I'm getting to. So the last slide I'll put up is just this one. Say, if you found any of that interesting at all, then much of it and a lot more actually besides is in the book. You can get a free chapter from my website, and there's actually quite a decent preview on Amazon as well, if you just want to go and have a look and see whether or not you like my style. Connect with me, please. Drop a line. And the last thing, just as a plug, a fortnight today, I'm running an event in London where I'll talk a little bit about this, but go a bit further into some of the background of how the process for writing the book. I'll do some signings and that sort of thing, and a glass of something fizzy, which is probably going to be Prosecco. As I said to Stuart earlier, I'm sorry, it may not be champagne, but it will be good enough. It will be wet, fizzy, and alcoholic. So, but we'll see. There's an open invitation to that, and that QR code will just take you to the sign up page for that. It's completely free.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. We kind of managed to get a lot in there, so I think I'm gonna have to go back and watch the video and kind of think about.
Yeah, I'm aware it was a little bit like in the back of the Matrix chair.
It's good though. It's good though. So, Adam, are there any questions from the chat?
Not seeing any questions. Obviously, if anyone wants to ask something, you can either drop it in the chat or shout now. Yes, I guess with all these things, like, because there's so much content there, it makes us think the book might be very worthwhile picking up.
Yes. Starting to question every single thing I've been told as well.
Well, as long as you question it in a group with diverse people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can I not go to a ski resort with 17 white middle-aged men? Is that not how we make a price? Okay.
That's definitely the start of a joke, Stuart.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. No.
Thank you, Harry. Love to see you.
Excellent. Cool. I don't think there's any other questions there.
Lovely. We will do 2 more slides and then we are done. So Adam did our shout outs today, so I'll let him
I'll quickly
go through them. It's not doing the share thing. Where's it gone? My mouse has literally got slow. It's got gunked up.
Right. Okay. Some upcoming events and shout outs. The first one, in fact, we've got 2 from Kanban Coaching Exchange. I do know you mentioned Ken Schwaber briefly in the talk, and some of those Kanban philosophies. When change is the only constant, how do you stay resilient through transition? So I thought that one looked very interesting. On the 23rd of January, there's Avoiding Fragmented Agility. That's with a Scrum event. Another one, this is you.
This is me. So this is a talk I was doing at the end of last year about AI's impact on agile roles, teams and practices. So this one's at Agile Oxford on the 28th.
So yeah. On the 29th, obviously, don't look at this, but on the 29th, go to London and get the book with Stephen Morris.
Yep.
Then 4th February, how Agile supports AI in marketing. So if you're into marketing and just interested in seeing how AI and Agile can come together with marketing, there's a really interesting looking event there with the marketing agility community. An interactive session with digital leadership on the 5th of February, if you're up for it, the Great Flow Experiment. So I believe they're doing an interactive game remotely online. I thought that one looked really interesting. So if you're into interactivity, that's a good one. The great Troy McGannis, if you've ever come across him, he does lots of really good forecasting spreadsheets, lots of really good material online, and he's doing a talk on forecasting at scale, no doubt, showing you some templates that you can use in your organization. For those who are in the Reading area, because this is Agile Reading after all. There is the Reading Geek Nights, where I believe Professor Ian Goff from Reduce Energy Limited will be talking about how you can reduce your energy. So definitely a good one to look out for. And then our next event is the 19th of February, where we've got Dominica coming in to talk about the courage to be different, embracing you as you are.
Excellent. Cool. So those are the shout outs we had. Does anyone on the group want to kind of have a shout out for anything they're doing, anything they want to share?
Buy Stephen's book.
Yeah, buy Stephen's book. Yeah, that's good. So final slide. We are still looking for speakers April onwards. I think we've got February, March booked, and then we need to kind of think about what we're doing April, May, June now. So we kind of got fairly well ahead of ourselves, and now we need to actually go and do some stuff for Q2 now. So if anyone wants to talk, get in touch with us, and we can talk about the talk about the kind of what we look for and all that kind of stuff. So if you have something already, click the link and we'll do that. So I'll send all of this stuff out in an email, maybe tomorrow, maybe Friday, but I will make sure that kind of everything gets shared, because it's quite hard to track it all otherwise. So otherwise, final round of applause for Stephen. So thank you very much for the talk, and thank you all very much for attending. So have a very good rest of your Wednesday. Cheers all. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.